Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our latest iteration of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society's History Group. We have with us this evening Dr. Rebecca Shapiro, and she's going to be giving us a talk about the etymology of the phrase, the term Little England, with which we're all so well acquainted. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to just give people like just a few minutes to log in. We're having people logging in as we speak on both Facebook and on Zoom. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. But until then, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have greetings or comments, you can put them in the chat. And if you have questions for Rebecca, we'll be asking them at the end of the presentation, and you can put them in the Q&A instead. That's just so it's easier for us to see the questions and put them to Rebecca. Thank you so much for your cooperation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again. It's great to have you with us this evening for our presentation from Dr. Rebecca Shapiro. She's an associate professor at the City University of New York, and she'll be speaking to us today about the etymology of the term Little England, which most people from Barbados will be very familiar with. We would have grown up hearing ourselves referred to in that manner. And now that we're on the verge of becoming a republic is an even more topical and interesting thing for discussion, I would expect. But the term Little England did not originate in Barbados. It in fact originated in Wales. And I'm going to invite Rebecca to tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Before I start, I have a number of people to thank. So in order of how I came to know Barbados and Barbadians, Jason Siegel, who is a lexicographer at UWI and who's the current director of the Lexicography Center, and Jeanette Alsop, who probably doesn't need any introduction, but the former director of the Lexicography Center and just mentor and scholar extraordinaire. Cora Belgrave, who is the department chair at the English and Linguistics department at UWI, for allowing me to have a class last year. And that will become important at the beginning of my talk. Vincent Haynes, who is in charge of the Exploring History, Caribbean History Facebook group with the many active people, and especially Dr. Carl Watson for sage advice. So my talk probably should not have happened. And the reason why I say that is because I was supposed to take my sabbatical, and which was supposed to start last spring, so January 2020, come to Barbados, teach a linguistics class, and do some research with students and everyday people on the change between the language of Barbados and maybe the language of New York, because that's where my students are from, or that's where their family is from, and many of them are from the Caribbean. And I wanted to take my interest in linguistics and dictionaries to Barbados and try to get a better connection and understanding of my current students, and also get the opportunity of teaching students who are from the region where my students are. So thank you, Cora, for giving me this class. However, and it was going absolutely wonderfully, except COVID. And I mean, the term "because COVID" is, omnipresent in the last, 12, 14 months. So when everything shut down, like the world, but particularly the borders of Barbados, I chose to stay. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, because I could see what was happening in New York and New Jersey, where I'm from, and I decided that I wanted none of that. And Barbados was a much safer place. And I'd begun to create a community, and I was actually still teaching. So I stuck around and taught my students on Zoom, and it was probably one of the best teaching experiences I've ever had. So that was great. But I no longer had a sabbatical project. So I talked with Dr. Siegel, and one day when it might have been a Zoom conference or one of the few days we were allowed out, and he said, well, you've asked me about how Little England developed. Why don't you, and he said, you devote your life to the history of words. Why don't you try to figure out where Little England came from? And of course, then I had to consult with Dr. Alsop, and she gave me a couple of great suggestions. And then we veered off onto this fascinating discussion about what Bimshire is, but that's another talk. And so I started using my time in lockdown, not just to teach, but also to do some really interesting research on the history of Little England. And at first I thought, well, it's a 20th century term, people just use it. And I found out that in fact, no, it's not just a 20th century term. It's not even a 19th century term or an 18th century term or a Barbadian term. It's a term that goes all the way back to about the 15th and 16th century for Wales. And so what I decided was that I would start the talk having you imagine what you think of, you know, people who are probably mostly from Barbados, what you think of as being the typical usage of the term Little England. And Kay, if you could advance to the next slide. Yeah, so this is what we normally think of when we see Little England. At this point, I think that when it's used at all or much used outside of Barbados, it's in touristical formats. You see it on glossy magazines, and so that's my commentary. How lush, how romantic, these cute cottages, and it's a little part of England in the Caribbean, so you can have your vacation and your Tesco, and that's not quite what it is at all. And so what I wanted to do is start with the sort of traditional or regularly commonly perceived notion of what Little England is, and then go backwards and then come forwards again. So Kay, if you could advance to the third slide. So as I was doing some research last fall, I had amassed a huge number of primary and secondary sources about the usage of Little England in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And then I started finding secondary sources. People were writing about Little England as it were like a scholarly, a dictionary of confusable terms. And so the author of this, and you probably can't see this, but the author of this dictionary has decided that these are in fact separate. Little England and Little England Beyond Wales are in fact separate terms and separate things. And as I've begun to do more and more writing and more research about this topic, I fear that this might turn into a book. But my idea is that, in fact, they're really not separate at all, because essentially it is England trying to impose itself and its identity and a kind of exclusivity and exceptionalism on various parts of the world, including itself. And so there are a lot of people who still think that they might be separate ideas. Little England, Barbados, Little Englander, as you might be familiar with what was going on with Brexit, and then Little England Beyond Wales. And again, I'm arguing that way back when, they were actually one term that have split into separate and several senses as time has gone by. Okay, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so this is where the Little England term began. This is Wales, but the portion of Little England beyond Wales is in the green, and it's probably difficult to see on the screen, but there's a sort of a diagonal line of castles and fortifications and moats and probably dragons that are differentiating the non-English part of Wales from the English part of Wales. And so this is the first time that we get the idea of England as an idea, but also England as a concept. So there are constituents of England within other places, because Wales at that time wasn't part of the larger English empire yet. And so I want to think about, or have you think about, what exactly it means to have something be little. It's a constituent part. It's England, Little England specifically, resembles or epitomizes England on a smaller scale. It's a colony, a microcosm colony, microcosm. And there's another definition where it's a foreign place full of English people. And the epigraph, by the way, of my paper is, "We smile at an Englishman's traveling apparatus contrived for carrying with him a little England wherever he moves." I'm sure that, you know, lots of people around the world do not appreciate that. So Little England beyond Wales is from about 1553, 1559, where we get a really good sense of when this began to be developed. And this is, that portion is mostly the area of Pembrokeshire in Wales. It's mostly known for being Anglophonic and separate from the Welsh speakers. And what's interesting now is because of the reoccurrence of the Welsh language, all of a sudden being English and monolingual English speaking is no longer as important. So there's kind of a differentiation between what is valued in Wales. Is it English or is it Welsh? It's clearly becoming Welsh, and English is taking a bit of a nosedive. Okay, so we've got the next slide here. I find kind of interesting because as I started thinking about how often Little England gets used, it's quite a bit. And so this is Google Ngram Viewer. And what it does, if you've never used it before, by the way, I learned of this many years ago from Linda Troost, who's a colleague. I think she's watching, and she's in Pennsylvania. And when she used this, I forget even what term it was, but I was like, wow, this is so amazing. I could look at a particular term over time, and I can map onto the term what was happening at the time. So you can go into when it was being used, books and articles that used it. And so one of the things that I do in my classroom is I introduce students to Google Ngram Viewer with the word terrorism, because a lot of times I start studying the French Revolution, and you see terrorism around 1789. And then around 2000, year 2000, and then 2001. So I always talk to my students about what is happening in history when we are using terms more. And I think this is kind of an interesting idea to map out when people were using Little England. And it's probably also difficult to see when people were doing it, but it's almost all of that huge spike is in the 19th century. There was enormous things going on in England, the empire, the colonies, and also Europe. So there was a lot of activity going on that was sort of happening about Little England in various different locations, but also iterations. So one of the first things, as you know, is Little England as Barbados, right? And that has been since the very early 17th century. And Barbados is the only one, as you probably know, that has Little England applied to it in its entirety. And I'll get to another slide in a moment, but Little England in its entirety is, I think, in some ways very specific and very important to think about. And the value that Barbados had to England, not as of a area full of people, but as an area full of economic resources. And that, of course, is one of the greatest insults to the empire, or to the people who were in the empire, most especially the ones who were enslaved, of course. one of the most important scholars current in Barbados history, Sir Hilary Beckles, writes, by the 1650s, England was grandly celebrating Barbados as its premier global investment. Notice his economic language is not a mistake. The island had provided impetus for the breakthrough into profitable colonialism, and the nation had long desired but found irritatingly elusive. Henceforth, the national discourse on trade and economic growth, wealth creation and mercantilism, sovereignty and security, and ethnic identity were tied to the colony's performance as a Black slave society. It was the beginning of a new era in global economic development and race relations. So this is important because, again, Barbados is not so much as of a place, but really an idea. And it's an economic idea full of fungible, transmutable currency. And this currency were enslaved human beings who were then forced to work and produce and assist the economy for England. At the same time, there was something concurrent in, let's see, I think this is the next slide. We've gone to, nope, I want to, okay, yes. So what I'd like to do before we get to that is, let's see here. I have a quote from that poem, but okay. If we can go to the next slide. So the Bridgetown Mercury Gazette and some of the other Caribbean newspapers were using Little England in a variety of terms. And one of them was used by white planters and white visitors and whites and otherwise elites who were visiting from other places as a positive way of description. Now, this June 1814 edition is a poem celebrating the birth of 1814, and not entirely sure why it's published in June and yet it's about the new year, but that's another question somebody else I'm sure can answer. So the poem, though, is this ode to the beauty and the lushness and the greenery and the similitude of Little England, Barbados, and its prominence in the Caribbean. Forgetting, of course, that there was still yet another England, or Little England. And so I would like to then bring your attention to, actually no, let me describe some of what people were motivated by. This poem sort of represents this idealized version, and a scholar who's made a huge impression on me in my work, not so much using it for, but sometimes using it against, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. And what we're seeing here and other examples are imagined communities. This is an imagined community of what England could be like if it were lush, tropical, warm, green, and left on its own away from, for example, the French. So the response then was for people to create an imagined, idealized version of England outside of the boundaries, focus on Barbados and as a like almost paradisical place. Somehow it became reminiscent of the old country, and there are social norms that provided an illusion that England and the English were still on top. And it's not quite the case throughout the 19th century. This has not not yet become this nostalgic idea of Little England, but it was a positive envisioning of it. And there's really an interesting conversation between Little England and Mother England, which one could argue is parochial and also patronizing, because some of the responses from the people in English were to mock and derogate the people in Barbados for putting on airs and trying to pretend that they were in fact better than they were. Okay, so let's see. Let us go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, concurrently, we have Little England in England happening. So we've got Little England, Barbados, Little England, England. And what was going on at that point is we have William Gladstone in relative competition with Benjamin Disraeli, trying to find and cement what is the proper position of England's place in the world, and how it would actually deal with the concerns of the empire, or as its concerns with the empire, but also people at home. So Gladstone was known for trying to be a reformer, and he tried to pull back on the imperial project at the as an attempt to protect workers and workers' rights in England itself. So it was trying to, one would not call it xenophobic, but one might call it protectionist. He was trying to protect people who were in need at home. So there was, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. People were losing their jobs because of mechanization, and he felt that his job was to make smaller the empire and focus on Little England itself as an island. So we have then these two competing visions, and it seems as though as the 19th century goes on, Little England as Barbados becomes to grow less important in the minds of the English. And that's where the first slide comes in. It becomes sort of less important after enslavement ended, after there were the reparations to the planters. And so Barbados, as the jewel in the crown of the empire, began to become less economically viable, and Little England, England began to be more of a focus on England's attention. And the idea of Little England as a tourist attraction started to take greater prominence. And there was an interesting dissonance between then how the English began to be perceiving Barbados versus how the Barbadians began to be perceiving themselves. So there's this kind of interesting positivity. At the same time, there's some negativity going on. Criticisms from the English, criticisms from Trinidadians, or criticisms from Jamaica. And so there's, I am loath to get involved in any kind of intra-island, what's the word, conflict, but I'm understanding from my students that Jamaica has tried to kidnap Rihanna and claim her as their own. And I think that the Barbadians may have something to say about that. But all throughout the last several hundred years, the idea of Little England has this concept of exceptionalism within it. Whenever it's being used, whether it's the elites in Barbados, the planters elites in Barbados, the early, the elite Blacks in Barbados, or the English who are imposing themselves on Barbados. It's the idea that they are better. Okay, let us move to the next slide, which is, I think that's number 8. Yeah, so I think this is kind of representative of the decline in the empire, the English empire, and the decline in the power of Little England as it was reflected in Barbados as an entity. Because what we end up having is Little England in India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and as I was looking for more Little Englands, I found, I believe there are actually 3 Little Englands in India. And so to me, what this means is that the English were no longer really able to claim an entire landmass or an entire region or an entire country as Little England, but they were reduced to taking claim to certain little bits and pieces of regions, and almost like hunkering down and saying, okay, this is my neighborhood in this wider area. And it's almost a reflexive and kind of a very conservative move. And it's sort of a fortress mentality in a way. Okay, so let's see. Looks like I'm getting close to my sort of 30-minute, we talked about like the sweet spot of a 30-minute talk. What I would like to end with is not yet the last slide, because that's my favorite slide. But the idea, yeah, we might as well. Okay, so Little England as Barbados has been in sort of conversation with itself for at least 40, 50 years now. And I started trying to do some research as to, is Little England Barbados positive or negative? How is it being talked about? Who are saying positive things about it? Who is saying negative things about it? And just briefly, I went to the Nation the Nation newspaper, and for the archives, I think it's about the last 15 or 20 years that I could search online. I typed in Little England. I looked at every single usage that I could, and there were roughly half positive and half negative. And that's important to remember, that even now, and it didn't really change over time. So it wasn't that there were more positive early and more negative now. It seemed to be quite a constant occurrence. However, when I went on Twitter, which I'm told I'm too old for, but I'm able to use it. When I typed in the search Little England, it's almost exclusively a negative term. And I found that to be fascinating, because we can assume that there's a generational contrast, and there's something happening between the people who use Little England positively versus the people who use it negatively. And so my last experience before I was repatriated in July was at 2 of the Black Lives Matter protests. And unfortunately, we find ourselves coming full circle in Minneapolis this week. The first one was in early June in front of the US Embassy. And it was, I have to say, a very orderly and tepid affair. Maybe 100 people, more likely 75. And it was, I observed with a couple of friends, and we were politely asked to leave after a couple of hours by the police. And after some unhappiness and a bit of discussion, we left. But on the way out, I heard this woman mutter under her breath. And to me, it summed up the entire like 400 years. She said, this is typical of insert inappropriate word, Little England. And I heard her as she was walking away, and I thought, this is my paper. And then the next Black Lives Matter was really focused about not so much the abuses in front of the American embassy, but on Nelson and how Black Lives Matter could be affecting and have an arrangement with Barbadians and their own history and their own statues. And so I got to take a photo of Nelson, and apparently he is in need of company with other statues that have been taken down. So that is, I'm now at 50 seconds, so I'm doing really well. That's my end of the paper. And I wanted to thank people for being here. I wanted to thank people for coming. I have learned so much. And I came back this January, and I had the pleasure of being under lockdown again, and not because of COVID, but because of volcanic ash. But I'm so glad to be here. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Shapiro, for that very entertaining and engaging presentation. I've certainly learned a lot about the etymology of the word Little England, the term Little England, but also you made some quite interesting connections for us. We're going to move into question and answer. Just before we do that, a quick reminder to our participants. You can make comments in the chat, but for questions to go to Dr. Shapiro, please put them in the Q&A. For those of you on Facebook, if you put the questions in the chat, we have someone on standby who is giving those questions to me as well. Thank you. So let's go to our first question. It says, thank you for your interesting talk. This one is from Facebook, and for providing this analysis of the history of the term Little England. Given your research, do we think that there are also opportunities for critical rereadings of references to Barbados as Little England that exist in folk songs and other aspects of our heritage as we continue to decolonize the archive of our cultural identities?
Yes, my expertise is absolutely not folk tales and songs. However, I'm aware of people who do that work. Oh no, what's her name? Barbara Lala, I think, is somebody who works on this, and in terms of folklore and telling stories and dialect. And I can't remember which campus of UE she's at, but she would be someone who would be helpful for that. Also, Dr. Jeanette Alsop would be a really good resource for that as well. But I think as people look critically at the history of the term in conjunction with looking at the idea of what it meant at particular times, then you can get a sense of who was using it, what their purpose was, and how to kind of react against it or with it, or how to engage in conversation with it. So there is a question about not sharing the screen right now. Although that Nelson is pretty impressive.
We have a question from Jennifer Reed. She says, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm wondering about when this imagined geography gets reversed in the 18th and 19th centuries. There's an area associated in London with poverty and crime that's known colloquially as the Caribbee Islands or the Cribby Islands. I've always thought of this as an attempt to both enable the so-called undesirable English people by imagining that they're on an island set loose from London, and also an inevitable bringing in of all the negative feeling about the Caribbean colonies, a kind of combined centrifugal movement. How does the reversal of the imagined geographies work in relation to the use of the term Little England, in your opinion?
Thank you. I have it's somewhere in my many pages here. So there was a quotation that I didn't include in the paper, but by the way, there's an area in the city of the English city of Reading called I think Little Barbados, and I think this is a different experience than what you're talking about, where it's a place of maybe comfort, like Little Italy is in New York, for example, where people who wanted to be there were there. But what you're talking about is something a little bit different. And so, of course, you know, I won't find what I was looking for. So depressing. One wants something and can't have it. How typical. So here I am. There was a really interesting book that was an anthropological study of some students who had gone from the Caribbean, not just Barbados, but they had gone from Caribbean nations to study in England. And they were being interviewed in England by English people and getting their ideas and interpretations about what it was like being there. So the interesting thing that I took away, and of course, I'm sure the students who were interviewed took away, was this incredible dissonance between, and this was, I think, in the 1950s and 60s. So this idea of being somewhat proud of being connected to England, you know, Mother England, and having been a Little England. And of course, most of us, I guess, would be aware of that apocryphal telegram last said to be sent by Grantley Adams. What is it? Never fear, you know, England, Little England is behind you, or something that actually has been known to have shown up in something like 5 different time periods. So the idea that Little England would not be even littler in England is probably upsetting. So here's one of the quotations from a student. You want to do the right thing, and if you have any pride at all, you get hurt. Because in Barbados, you've been brought up to think of yourself as coming from Little England, and you suddenly discover that you aren't English at all, and that all the English considered you an outsider and uncivilized. And you were so proud of belonging to a Little England at home, and English history is your history, and you were a part of it, you thought. So they discover that they're not English at all, and that causes people to, I'm sure, figure out or try to figure out what, if they're not English, they're not Little English, what in fact are they? And in England, they're othered, and the term other has such a resonant meaning because it can apply to any group of people who feel that they do not belong and are not part of the dominant group in society. You can be in Barbados and still feel othered, or you can be in England and feel othered, or you can be a woman in a room full of men and feel othered. So it's a very useful and just an instructive way to think about it. And it's this othering that is happening. And I'm thinking that the neighborhood that you're talking about, and going back to the Little England beyond Wales, it's like there's a moat, right? There is a moat around this region or neighborhood where people from the Caribbean are placed so that they are separate from, and other people do not have to interact with them. And speaking of moats and separations. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the original term ghetto was from 17th century Venice, and it was the literal walled community of the where the Jews had to live, and they every night they had to be put back into the ghetto, and it was locked. So the idea of this separation, physical separation, and also imaginary separation is really potent.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Quite a bit to chew on there. We've actually had quite a bit of discussion amongst ourselves this year, this last year or so within the museum. We did an exhibition actually, which featured the kind of migration that we would have had to Britain after the Second World War, and which culminated in what we call the Windrush scandal many decades later. And we've got quite a bit of documentary evidence here where people do speak to this not feeling a sense of belonging in England, even people who were born generations later in England, but also not really connecting back with Barbados as well.
Yes.
We have another question. This is an anonymous person. They say, do you have any comment about British literature taught in Barbados, such as romantic nature poetry or English history?
Well, funny you should say. I'm ready for that because one of the books that I think has probably the best title maybe ever is called Growing Up Stupid Under the Union Jack. And that is Austin Clarke. And he writes about growing up in the 1940s and 1950s. He spends a great amount of time thinking about, as a child, around World War II and what Barbados's connection to World War II is as it related to England. But he also there's two episodes that I remember really clearly. One was when he was learning Wordsworth, and he was learning poems about a daffodil, and he was thinking to himself, what is a daffodil? And what does it have to do with me? And then the other poetic comment that I have about Clarke's memoir novel was he's reading again Wordsworth about as lonely as a cloud. And having spent the better part of a year in Barbados and under lockdown of various sorts, I look up at the sky an awful lot because that's like the outside. And I do not see lonely clouds, and I do not see, quiet, fluffy, lonely clouds at all. I see them racing across the sky and these big, things that just kind of move on by. So the idea that there's this sort of wonderful connection to nature, and it's gentle and healing, and we can commune with it, does not really, I think, resonate in a lot of ways with people who are from here. I had a cockroach that almost became my pet last year because it just wouldn't go away. I have a friend who cannot stand lizards, and yet there they are. Or roosters, not my friends. And so the idea that romantic literature and the idea that a Barbadian education should be based on romantic, with a capital R, English literature is kind of farcical. It's good to know it because it's good to know romantic or English literature as much as it's good for me, a Jew, to know the New Testament, because so much of Western culture and literature is based on English literature or French literature or biblical references. But it's really important to get a sense of what owns one's own identity and what one's own cultural references are. So I think maybe that answers your question. And before I actually say that, when I talk to my own students who are almost exclusively from other places or their parents were from other places, I say, let's learn the rules first, then let's learn how to break them.
Thanks very much, Dr. Shapiro. That's actually a quite interesting take on how to view literature. I myself, I actually did English literature right all the way up to university level. And West Indian literature featured very sparingly during that time period. And as a student, particularly in my undergraduate years, I sometimes found it quite difficult to connect to the West Indian syntax, the West Indian way of expressing oneself, to connect with even the story, because so much of what I learned had been couched in the English way of seeing things. I was actually more comfortable reading Chaucer in Old English than I was in reading In the Castle of My Skin, for example. So now that things are changing, now that we're attempting to put our own national perspective, our own culture into the classroom, it's great to be able to deconstruct these terms and deconstruct the ideas that are centered around these terms in order for us to really get a proper perspective on these things. It looks as though we are not really having any more questions this evening. So it looks as though we're going to be wrapping up for now. So once again, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Shapiro, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. It has been an interesting and wonderful lecture and discussion afterwards. And thank you to the audience as well from logging in from all around the world. We're getting lots of compliments on what a wonderful talk it has been. We will pass those on to Dr. Shapiro after the talk. Thank you all so much for tuning in and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. I learned so much. Thank you so much.